You probably picture it already, don't you? A majestic ribbon of stone winding through misty mountains, dignified soldiers standing proud on watchtowers, the sun rising gently over a perfectly ordered empire. It's the image you've seen in glossy travel documentaries, or perhaps the romantic drone shots that every filmmaker seems contractually obligated to capture. In this vision, the Great Wall of China is not just a wall, it's civilization's ultimate achievement, a monument to unity, order and protection. But then you remember, you're not a tourist. You're not standing on a neatly restored section of stone in the 21st century, clutching a selfie stick. No, in this story you're actually there, and that changes everything. Instead of walking in comfortable sneakers, you're trudging in ill-fitting sandals. Instead of gazing at endless views of misty hills, you're staring at a pile of rocks that somehow all need to be carried up that very hill. And instead of being told, "Welcome to one of humanity's wonders," you're told, "Pick up that stone and don't stop." The wall, in your imagination, is a clean line. In reality, it was a messy patchwork. Built, rebuilt, extended and repaired over centuries by countless hands that never got a credit line in the history books. It wasn't all stone either. Sometimes it was rammed earth, mud mixed with straw, or whatever local material could be dragged from the ground. Your Great Wall experience would depend less on some emperor's dream and more on the dirt beneath your feet at that particular stretch of land. And you, of course, would not be one of the elegant generals issuing orders. You'd be among the thousands of anonymous labourers, peasants, conscripts, prisoners, who were told their patriotic duty was to lift, dig and sweat until their bodies gave out. Nobody asked if you wanted the job. Nobody promised a plaque with your name carved into it. At best, you were told it was for the good of the empire. At worst, you were told nothing at all. Imagine waking before dawn. The air still cool but heavy with dust. The smell isn't fresh mountain air, it's the sour tang of unwashed clothes, of smoke from last night's weak fire, of earth that's been churned over and over. You shuffle to your assigned place, stomach empty except for maybe a rough grain porridge, and you're handed a tool that feels heavier than you do. And then you work, and you work, and you keep working until the sun decides to drop behind the hills. This was the reality behind the wall. Not a clean postcard, but an endless routine of exhaustion. Of course, let's pause for a moment. Why build something so enormous in the first place? The answer depends on which emperor you ask. The earliest walls were built long before the famous Ming Dynasty sections you might recognize today. The first attempts stretch back to the Warring States period, when rival kingdoms built smaller walls to protect themselves from one another. They weren't thinking of tourists or legacy. They were thinking about keeping their neighbors' armies or nomadic raiders at a manageable distance. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, came to power in the 3rd century BCE, he did what every ambitious ruler does. He thought big. He ordered the linking of existing walls and the construction of new ones, supposedly to keep out the Yuzhangan, nomadic tribes to the north. In practice, it was also about control, about drawing a visible line across the land that said, "This belongs to us." It's almost like a giant "Do Not Enter" sign carved into the mountains. But here's the thing. You don't see Qin Shi Huang sweating in the sun with a shovel. He's back in his palace, planning his next decree. You are the one who gets the privilege of turning imperial imagination into reality. And unlike him, you don't get servants bringing you elaborate meals. You might get a handful of millet, maybe, if supplies arrived on time. The romanticized vision of the Great Wall is a single unified project. In reality, it was waves upon waves of construction, repair, collapse, and rebuilding. Over the centuries, dynasties came and went, each one leaving behind scraps of wall like layers of an onion. By the time the Ming dynasty came along in the 14th century, much of what earlier rulers had built had crumbled into dust. So the Ming emperors decided to reinforce it, creating the stone and brick sections that tourists still marvel at today. And again, you wouldn't be strolling along those restored bricks. You'd be on your knees in the mud, ramming earth between wooden frames, your hands blistered raw. Stone walls make great Instagram photos. Rammed earth does not. Yet it was the backbone of much of the wall's length. Stone walls make great Instagram photos. Rammed earth does not. Yet it was the backbone of much of the wall's length. Packed layer upon layer, pressed down with sheer human force, until it hardened into something that could stand against wind and weather. But if you've ever tried pressing sand together at the beach, you already know the process is endless, and your back would tell you so. Let's address the myth of honor. You might imagine that being called to build the wall was considered noble, patriotic, maybe even glorious. In truth, it was closer to punishment. Many of the workers were peasants forced into labor because they couldn't pay their taxes. Others were convicts or prisoners of war sent as a sentence. Instead of rotting in a jail, you rotted slowly on the slopes of northern China, carrying stones. You wouldn't exactly feel motivated. You wouldn't think, yes, this is my proud duty to defend the empire. You'd more likely think, why me? Why here? Why is this rock heavier than I am? And while you imagine a mighty defensive line against invaders, reality was far less tidy. Walls can slow down raids, but they can't stop them completely. Gaps existed. Soldiers could be bribed, and nomadic horsemen weren't exactly afraid of a long stretch of mud and stone. The wall was as much psychological as physical, a statement of dominance rather than a perfect barrier, which means you might be working day after day, breaking your body for something that could still be bypassed. A demoralizing thought, if you allowed yourself the luxury of thinking at all. Now picture the landscape. It isn't a flat construction site with neat scaffolding. It's mountains, ridges, valleys, rivers. Some sections crawl up impossible slopes like a stone staircase designed by a sadist. And you're expected to drag every material up there by hand, often without animals or carts. The donkeys and oxen, after all, were considered too valuable for war efforts or farming, so you were the beast of burden. The soundscape is equally unromantic. There's no triumphant soundtrack playing, just the scrape of stone, the grunt of men, the dull thud of earth being tamped down. The occasional bark of an overseer, reminding you that no matter how tired you feel, the wall is still longer than your willpower. If you're lucky, there's the whistle of wind across the ridges. If you're unlucky, there's the hollow growl of your stomach. Think of the irony. This great wall is supposed to protect the empire, but you, the builder, don't feel protected by anything at all. Not from hunger, not from exhaustion, not from the cold. The wall is being built to shield others, but it won't shield you. And here's the most sobering detail. For every neat block of stone you see today, countless lives were poured into the foundation, not in a dramatic, bloody way, more in a quiet, draining way. People simply faded, swallowed by the pace of labor, the harshness of weather, the absence of care. The wall might be strong, but the humans behind it were fragile. Yet, history doesn't give you a name. It doesn't say, here lies Li, who carried 50 stones before he couldn't carry one more. It just says the wall was built. That's the final insult of empire. Your suffering becomes a footnote, and even then not a very detailed one. So, let's return to where we started. You've seen the beautiful pictures, you've admired the majesty of the wall, but would you have survived building it? Probably not. Not because you're weak, but because almost no one could. The wall wasn't designed to be survivable for its workers. It was designed to be endurable for the empire. And that's the reality. The Great Wall of China is indeed great. Great in ambition, great in scale, great in the toll it took on those who built it. You'd admire it far more as a distant observer than as a participant. One thing that never makes it into the tourist brochures is the sheer unevenness of the wall. You might imagine a uniform structure, same height, same thickness, same design. In truth, the wall was more like a patchwork quilt stitched together across centuries, regions, and dynasties. One section might be stone, the next might be rammed earth, the next little more than a mound of tamped dirt, pretending to be a fortification. For you, as a worker, this meant constant adaptation. One day you were hauling stones, the next you were mixing clay and straw, the day after that you were dragging timber across hills. There was no consistency, except in how hard it was. This patchwork tells a story about geography. Northern China isn't one simple landscape, it's a mosaic of climates and terrains. In the east, near the coast, summers were sticky, winters were bitter, and the soil turned into mud at the slightest hint of rain. In the northwestern deserts, on the other hand, water was so scarce that workers would sometimes carry barrels of it from miles away just to mix earth into something usable. In the mountains, storms could blow in without warning, scattering dust so thick it felt like breathing sandpaper. And in each place you, the unlucky labourer, had to adapt with whatever primitive tools were available. Climate wasn't just discomfort, it was danger. Summers in the Gobi fringes could bake the ground until your sandals stuck like clay to a kiln. Winters could leave you shivering at night with nothing but a thin blanket or shared body heat for warmth. The wall crossed all of it: fertile plains, jagged peaks, deserts where you could lose your sense of direction in an hour. It's almost as if the emperors wanted to test not just whether the wall could be built, but whether human endurance could be stretched across the full catalogue of unpleasant weather known to humankind. Another unspoken reality: disease. Imagine living shoulder to shoulder with thousands of exhausted men, eating poorly, drinking questionable water, and working until your body gave out. Sickness spread quickly. A cough wasn't just a cough, it was a signal that half the camp might be wheezing in a week. Cuts and blisters weren't just irritations. Without clean water or medicine, they became slow infections. And yet you couldn't simply call in sick. You were here to work, whether you had the strength or not. The wall would not pause for your fever. Now let's take a small tangent about food, because food, or the lack of it, shaped your day more than anything. The rations were basic: millet gruel, sometimes a few beans, occasionally dried vegetables if supplies were generous. Meat was rare, more a rumour than a reality. Salt was precious, and spices were a luxury you'd never taste. So meals blurred into a tasteless repetition, the same texture day after day. If you've ever eaten plain porridge for breakfast, you can imagine the dullness. Now imagine it for breakfast, lunch and dinner for months. Your body worked like a furnace, burning through calories, but the fuel was little more than damp straw. What about the people around you? Not comrades in arms, not a cheerful band of brothers, just a mixed collection of peasants, conscripts and prisoners. Some were silent, resigned. Others muttered curses under their breath. Angry at the empire, angry at the sky, angry at their luck. You might hear snippets of folk songs, low and tired, not joyful, but rhythmic, a way to keep hands moving when strength ran low. And then, of course, the overseers. Men who did not carry stones themselves, but carried whips of authority. They weren't cartoon villains, not always, but they were a constant reminder that hesitation was noticed and slowness was punished. You learned quickly that pace mattered more than health. It's easy to imagine this as a purely physical ordeal, but psychologically it was perhaps worse. The monotony was crushing. Each day bled into the next, indistinguishable except for the weight of the rocks and the angle of the sun. You began to lose track of time. Weeks stretched into seasons, seasons into years, with only the faint progress of the wall snaking across hills to mark the passage. The mental toll was heavy, a sense of invisibility, of being forgotten even as your body was still present. You worked, but the empire barely remembered you were alive. There's also the irony of scale. From your perspective on the ground, the wall didn't look like the Great Wall. It looked like an endless construction site. You couldn't see its grandeur, only the next pile of earth, the next unfinished tower, the next line of stones waiting for your back. The greatness was invisible. Only later, when enough centuries had passed, did it become a marvel. For you, it was just work that never ended. Imagine cleaning an endless hallway. You'd never admire its beauty, only its refusal to let you rest. Let's add a cultural note. In Chinese history, walls had always been more than barriers. They symbolized order. They marked the line between civilization and the chaos beyond. Inside the walls was control, farming, ritual, hierarchy. Outside was wilderness, nomads, uncertainty. So when you were told to build the wall, you weren't just moving rocks, you were literally defining civilization. At least that's what the officials said. But while you lifted stone after stone, you probably didn't feel like a cultural hero. You just felt the ache in your shoulders. It's worth pausing on the irony of labor itself. The wall was supposed to defend China from invasions, but by conscripting so many peasants, the state often weakened its own villages, leaving farms untended and families unsupported. Some historians note that building the wall created as many problems as it solved, draining resources, exhausting manpower, and fueling resentment among the people. So while you hauled stones to keep the empire safe, Your own home village might have been struggling with empty fields and hungry mouths. In that sense, the wall wasn't just a physical burden, it was a social one. And then there's the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses on you after hours of repetitive labour. The kind that makes you aware of every creak in your back, every pebble in your shoe, every beat of your tired heart. Sometimes the wind would whistle, sometimes men would murmur, but more often than not, you lived inside that silence. It was the sound of an empire stretching itself across the horizon, using your body as its instrument. At night, when work finally ended, you didn't retreat to a warm inn. You collapsed on rough mats, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, with little to separate you from the cold ground. The stars above might have been brilliant. Northern China's skies are famously wide and clear, but you were often too tired to look. Rest wasn't rest. It was just the temporary absence of motion. You closed your eyes, hoping not to be woken by hunger or cold, or the cough of the man beside you. And before you knew it, dawn returned, and the cycle repeated. This is the part that modern travellers rarely imagine. They see the wall as a finished product, a silent monument. But for you, it was never finished. It was always in progress, always demanding, always stretching further. Like a treadmill built of stone, it kept you moving but never brought you anywhere. So when people say the Great Wall is one of humanity's greatest achievements, they are not wrong. But if you were one of the countless who carried its stones, you might argue that it wasn't an achievement at all. It was simply a burden transferred from the emperor's imagination onto your shoulders, a wonder of the world for everyone else, a weight of the world for you. Let's talk about one of the most persistent myths, that the Great Wall is visible from space. You've probably heard it before, in a schoolbook or from a well-meaning teacher. The idea sounds poetic, that something built by human hands could stretch so far that astronauts would see it like a scar on the planet's surface. In reality, it isn't true. The wall is long, yes, but it's also narrow and built of stone that blends with the landscape. From orbit, it disappears into the ridges and valleys. You could look down from the International Space Station and not spot a thing, so the myth is charming, but the truth is a little disappointing. And if you were one of the workers, you might chuckle darkly at the thought, all this suffering and you can't even see it from the stars. The myth itself reveals something about how people want to see history. They prefer stories of grandeur, of cosmic significance, but the lived reality was earthy, dusty and small. You didn't feel like you were shaping the planet. You felt like you were hauling yet another stone. In a way, this gap between myth and reality is the essence of the wall's history. Emperors imagined majesty, poets praised its scale, and labourers only felt the weight in their hands. Now compare this to other monumental works. Take the pyramids of Egypt. Tourists imagine them as perfect gleaming triangles, while the workers who actually dragged limestone blocks probably saw only sweat, sand and aching muscles. Or think of Roman aqueducts, graceful arches that carried water to cities, yet behind each arch was an army of anonymous hands who chipped stone for years. These projects share a common thread. Posterity remembers the beauty, but the builders lived the burden. The wall was no different, except it stretched further than almost any project before or since. For you, that meant the work was not just hard, it was endless. Another comparison worth making is to medieval European castles. Those fortresses were smaller, local, tied to the power of one lord or one region. The wall, on the other hand, wasn't about protecting one village or one city. It was about drawing a line across entire landscapes. Imagine being told that your task was not just to build a house or a fortress, but to literally reshape the horizon. That scale is what set the wall apart, and what made it so crushing for the people beneath it. It's also interesting to think about how outsiders perceived it. To nomadic tribes approaching from the north, the wall must have seemed like a strange statement, a massive line telling them they did not belong, and yet walls never fully stopped movement. Horses could skirt around weak sections, gaps could be exploited, bribes could be offered. To some, the wall was less a barrier and more a challenge, a dare issued by the empire. To you, the builder, it meant your suffering might not even achieve its goal. The wall could still be crossed. Inside the empire, the wall carried symbolic weight. Chinese poetry often described it as both a source of pride and sorrow. Scholars wrote about its grandeur, while folk songs lamented the lives spent building it. You might imagine hearing a tune hummed at dusk by fellow workers, the lyrics softened over time but carrying that mixture of pride and grief. That duality of awe and despair became part of the wall's cultural identity. There's also the matter of scale in numbers. Historians debate exactly how many people worked on the wall over the centuries, but estimates reach into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. Imagine being one among so many. Your life, your effort, your pain dissolved into a vast sea of labour, indistinguishable. That anonymity was perhaps the greatest cruelty. You weren't building your wall, you were just one ant in an endless line of ants, carrying pebbles for a nest that would never remember you. Consider too the tools. Forget modern machinery, forget cranes, engines or power drills. You were given wooden frames for ramming earth, simple chisels, ropes and baskets. A stone that would take a forklift today had to be moved by sheer coordination of arms and backs. Even bamboo scaffolding, which might seem light and clever, was still treacherous, slippery in rain, swaying in the wind. Every moment of construction was physical improvisation, with the human body as the only true machine. And yet, for all the hardship, there's a strange irony. The wall, as you built it, was never truly finished. It eroded, collapsed, and was rebuilt countless times. Entire sections disappeared into the earth, swallowed by sandstorms or washed away by floods. The very ground beneath sometimes betrayed you. Centuries later, farmers would cart off stones to build houses, leaving only traces of your labour behind. So even if you gave your health, your years, perhaps your life, the wall did not promise permanence. Parts of it simply faded, leaving no evidence you had ever been there. Let's step into the mind of an overseer for a moment. While you toiled, he stood apart, shouting orders, perhaps sipping water from a better ration. His life wasn't easy either, responsible for quotas, for progress, for reporting to higher officials. But his hardship was one of authority, not labour. He was measured by results, not by the weight of stones on his shoulders. You might resent him, but in truth, he too was a cog in the Empire's machine, trapped in a different kind of burden. From top to bottom, the wall was a hierarchy of suffering, some sharper, some duller, but suffering nonetheless. And yet, there is one final layer of irony. The very thing that exhausted you, that drained lives and reshaped landscapes, would one day become a symbol of national pride. Centuries later, poets, travellers, and finally tourists would marvel at it. The empire that conscripted you might collapse, but the wall would outlive its politics. The emperors are gone, the overseers are forgotten, you too would be forgotten, but the stones remained, a silent witness to every back that bent beneath them. So if you stood there today, looking at a gleaming section restored for visitors, you might feel a complicated mix of bitterness and awe. Yes, it is beautiful. Yes, it is great. But you'd know the truth, that greatness was bought at the cost of countless small, invisible lives, lives like yours. So here you are. Not a tourist, not a poet, not even a soldier on guard. You are simply a pair of hands. Hands the Empire has borrowed for a project larger than your imagination. And like all borrowed things, you'll eventually be used up. Your day begins before dawn. The air at that hour is sharp, cold enough to bite at your skin no matter the season. A whistle or shout calls you from the straw mat where you've slept, and you rise with stiffness in every joint. The camp smells of damp earth, smoke from half-burned twigs, and the sourness of too many bodies pressed too close together. There are no leisurely mornings. No hot tea steaming in a porcelain cup. Just a quick movement from sleep to labour, as if life had no in-between states. Breakfast is a bowl of millet gruel, thick if supplies were generous, watery if they weren't. It tastes of almost nothing. Occasionally there's a sprinkle of salt which feels like a luxury. Eating it doesn't satisfy you so much as it quiets your stomach for an hour or two. You don't sit at a table, of course. You crouch or squat, bowl in hand, the ground your only furniture. Around you, men slurp in silence, already calculating the day's strength against the day's tasks. Then comes the walk. The wall isn't being built at your feet. It is always further, higher away. You trudge with your group, carrying baskets, ropes and tools, the path winding like a cruel joke. Some sections are steep, little more than goat trails carved into rock. Others stretch across plains, so flat and endless that you feel as if you're walking across the surface of time itself. The journey to the work site is already tiring, but it doesn't count as labor, it's merely the prologue to it. When you arrive, the overseer assigns tasks. If the section requires stone, you join a line of men hauling blocks, each one balanced on poles or slings. The stone bites into your shoulder, leaving raw spots that never really heal. If the section is rammed earth, you take up heavy mallets and pound soil into wooden frames until your arms feel hollow. Sometimes you carry water to soften the earth. Sometimes you climb scaffolds to tamp the top layer, the structure swaying with each blow. It is never the same job twice, but it is always heavy, always endless. The soundscape is monotonous, stone scraping on stone, mallets thudding in rhythm, the creak of ropes, shouts from overseers, often more about keeping pace than about any specific instruction. There is no music, no chant, just the dull percussion of human bodies turned into tools, and beneath it all, the steady hiss of the wind moving across ridges, reminding you that nature is the only thing bigger than the wall. You might think about pacing yourself, conserving strength, but there is no real way to do that. The work is designed to extract everything you have. If you go too slowly, you're noticed. If you stop, you're punished. So you learn a strange skill, how to work without hope of rest, how to keep moving, not because you can, but because not moving is worse. Lunch, when it comes, is brief. Another bowl of millet, maybe a scrap of dried vegetable. Sometimes, if the supply lines worked in your favor, a bit of bean paste. You eat quickly, squatting in the dust, trying not to think of food as pleasure, but as fuel. Then it's back to the line, back to the stones, back to the rhythm. The afternoon stretches long, the sun pressing down like an extra overseer, unblinking and merciless. By the time dusk arrives, you're not finished. The wall is never finished. You're simply allowed to stop. Tools are stacked, baskets dropped, and you shuffle back to camp. The walk feels longer in the evening, your body slower, every step like dragging a chain. When you arrive, the campfire smoke already hangs low. You collapse onto your mat, sharing the ground with dozens of others. There is no privacy, no separation, just rows of weary men lined like logs in a forest. The night is a paradox. Your body aches for rest, but the ground is hard, the air is cold, and your stomach still feels half empty. The man next to you snores, another coughs through the night. You pull your thin blanket tighter, trying to disappear into sleep. Sometimes you succeed, drifting into dreams where there are no stones, no overseers, only silence. More often you drift in and out, caught between exhaustion and discomfort. When dawn comes again, it feels as if you never truly rested. This was daily life, repetitive, draining, without glory. You weren't living a story about the greatness of the empire. You were simply trying to make it through another sunrise, another stone, another step. But there were small details too, things history doesn't record yet, shaped every day, like the way dust clung to your skin, turning sweat into mud, or the way your hands grew calloused, rougher than leather, until you barely recognized them as your own. The constant squint against sunlight, the grit between your teeth after a gust of wind, little discomforts that piled into something larger than pain, a dull, unrelenting erosion of comfort, of self. Occasionally there were brief moments of reprieve, a rare warm meal, a night when someone shared a folk tale around the fire, voices soft, almost embarrassed, as if entertainment itself were forbidden, or a morning when the sky was so clear that for a moment you forgot the wall and simply admired the horizon. These moments didn't erase the hardship, but they punctuated it, like tiny lanterns flickering in a long tunnel. The camp itself was basic, huts of mud or simple tents depending on the region. A central fire if wood was available, though often it wasn't, forcing men to huddle for warmth instead. Tools leaned in messy piles, buckets and baskets scattered about. Nothing permanent, nothing comforting. The camp was a moving organism, shifting as the wall advanced, leaving behind only ashes and footprints. You might have wondered, in the quiet of night, what it was all for. You were told it was to protect China, to keep the northern tribes away, but the wall never felt protective to you. It felt indifferent. A line that demanded your strength but gave nothing back. You weren't building safety, you were building distance. Distance between rulers and enemies, between civilization and wilderness, between your own life and the possibility of freedom. And so, day by day, you lived on the edge of the wall, not just physically on the edge of empire, but on the edge of endurance, always one step away from collapse, always one step away from being forgotten in the dust. When people imagine hardship, they usually picture the physical strain, the aching muscles, the bleeding blisters, the exhaustion. But on the wall, one of the cruelest weights wasn't the stone in your basket. It was the knowledge that there was no way out. This wasn't a job you could quit. It wasn't an apprenticeship where you could dream of promotion. It was a sentence, sometimes temporary, often indefinite. For many, it lasted until their bodies gave up. And if you thought about slowing down or resting too long, you would quickly discover the other layer of discipline, punishment. Overseers didn't need to invent anything dramatic. The work itself was punishment enough, but they had methods for making sure no one forgot the hierarchy. A man who lagged might be given double the weight the next day, or made to stand guard at night with no sleep. Sometimes he was simply beaten, not to kill but to remind. The goal wasn't correction, it was fear. You learned quickly that obedience was easier than resistance. There was also collective punishment. If one man shirked, the group might be denied food or forced to extend their shift. This turned you not just against the overseers, but against each other. If your neighbor slowed down, you resented him for making the whole line suffer. Division was built into the system. It kept men too busy blaming one another to unite against their masters. Yet, even in such a system, people found ways to cope. Humor was one of them. Not loud, joyous laughter, there was no energy for that. But small, dry remarks muttered under breath. Sarcasm about the endless stones. Jokes about how the wall might just circle the earth. Quips about overseers being too weak to carry their own voices. These fragments of humor were survival tools, tiny shields against despair. Superstition was another coping mechanism. Folk beliefs traveled with the workers from every corner of the empire. Some believed that tapping a stone 3 times before setting it down would keep it from shifting. Others tied bits of cloth around their wrists for protection, or whispered prayers into the soil as they tamped it down. Small rituals gave the illusion of control in a world where almost nothing could be controlled. At night, stories circulated, legends of spirits haunting the wall, of workers whose souls lingered in the stones, of ancestors watching with silent judgment. Such tales weren't meant to frighten. Life was already frightening enough, but to explain, to make sense of the endless labor by imagining that it had meaning beyond the emperor's orders. If your suffering became part of a myth, at least it wasn't meaningless. The social life of the camp was fragile but real. Groups formed, often based on shared villages or dialects. Men who spoke the same tongue clung together, translating commands for each other, sharing food when rations were short. These little networks offered protection in subtle ways. A friend could help you lift a heavier stone, or cover for you if you stumbled. Without them, you were isolated, and isolation was dangerous. Still, tensions ran high. Theft of food was common. Fights broke out, not with swords, but with fists and shoves, fueled by hunger and exhaustion. Overseers often ignored these squabbles, as long as they didn't disrupt the work. In a way, conflict was useful. It drained energy that might otherwise fuel rebellion. There were moments, though, when camaraderie peeped through the cracks. A shared song hummed in rhythm to the pounding of earth. A hand reaching out to steady another man on a swaying scaffold. The gift of a spare morsel of food on a particularly lean night. These gestures were small, but they were the only proof that humanity hadn't been entirely erased by the wall. Daily life also meant constant improvisation. Tools broke, ropes frayed, baskets split. You were expected to mend them with whatever was at hand. Strips of bark became rope, bent twigs became fasteners, stones became hammers when real ones weren't available. The wall wasn't just built with sweat, it was built with stubborn creativity. If something failed, you found a way, because failure wasn't an option. And then there was the body itself. Slowly, it stopped feeling like yours. It became more like an instrument. Hands that once held chopsticks or farm tools turned into claws of callus. Feet became numb from carrying loads day after day. Even pain dulled over time, not because it lessened, but because you adjusted. You stopped noticing aches unless they became unbearable. Fatigue became your baseline, as familiar as breathing. Yet the mind didn't dull so easily. Memories of home haunted you. The image of a family meal, of children laughing, of fields you once tended. They flickered in and out during the monotony of labour. Some men clung to those thoughts like treasures. Others buried them because remembering hurt more than forgetting. That choice, whether to remember or to numb yourself, was another quiet survival tactic. Water was its own daily battle. Clean streams were rare, and wells often muddy. You drank what you could, even if it tasted of iron or earth. The risk of sickness was constant, but thirst was worse. Sometimes you rationed your own water, taking small sips, making each drop stretch. Other times you drank greedily, unable to resist. The overseers didn't waste time worrying about quality. If water was there, you drank it. If not, you endured. Evening brought not just exhaustion but reflection. Around fires, men might debate whether the wall would ever truly keep enemies out. Some argued it was useless, that nomads would always find ways through. Others believed it was destiny, that China's greatness required such a structure. You sat quietly, listening, perhaps agreeing with both at once, because whether it was useless or necessary didn't matter. You were still the one holding the stone. And so daily life blurred into an unbroken cycle. Wake, eat, walk, lift, tamp, eat again, walk back, collapse, dream. Over and over, until seasons changed, overseers were replaced, or your body gave out. The wall stretched across the horizon, but for you it stretched across time itself, turning days into a flat, endless plane of repetition. In the end, your life as a builder of the Great Wall wasn't measured in days or seasons. It was measured in stones. Each stone lifted, each basket filled, each layer of earth tamped down. That was your calendar, your clock, your record. The wall did not care if you were hungry, or homesick, or sore. It demanded only movement, and in that demand it consumed years without ever giving them back. From a distance, future generations would marvel at its scale, perhaps even walk proudly along its ridges. But for you, the wall was not a monument. It was a routine, a rhythm, a weight on your back. It was dust in your lungs, calluses on your hands, and silence at night broken only by the snores and coughs of men as tired as you were. You might have hoped that one day the Empire would remember your effort, that your name would be written somewhere, carved into the stones, but history has no space for names at this scale. It remembers emperors, dynasties, the wall itself, but not the builders. For the Empire, you were temporary. For the wall, you were replaceable. And so you drifted through each day, not with glory, not with grandeur, but with endurance. Life on the edge of the wall was not heroic. It was simply survival, stretched thin across the horizon. The emperors who ordered the wall into existence never had to carry stones up a mountain. They sketched lines on maps, straight as brushstrokes, imagining a perfect boundary between empire and wilderness. But maps lie. The land itself was no flat parchment. It was jagged, brutal, and indifferent. And for you, the builder, the first enemy was not nomads from the north. It was the terrain beneath your feet. Start with the mountains. Northern China is carved with ranges that rise like stone spines across the land. Some slopes are so steep that even goats hesitate. Yet the wall was expected to climb them without pause. You were told to carry rocks not just across ground, but upward, one staggering step at a time. The air grew thinner, your breath shorter. A single slip on loose gravel could send you tumbling, basket and all, down a slope that cared nothing for your labour. Then came the valleys. At first glance, a valley might seem easier, flat, open, a reprieve from the climbing. But valleys had their own cruelty. In summer, heat pooled there like water in a basin, suffocating and heavy. In winter, winds funneled down the gaps, turning the valley floor into a corridor of ice. The wall was meant to stretch through it all, and so you worked whether the air pressed like fire or stabbed like knives. And then there were the deserts. Parts of the wall crawled across the edges of the Gobi, where the land was nothing but sand and stone under an unrelenting sky. Imagine working there. No shade, no trees, no rivers, just the hiss of sand against your skin. You carried water as if it were gold, rationing each drop, watching it evaporate before it touched your lips. Your skin cracked, your lips bled, and the sandstorm was always waiting, ready to erase hours of labor in a single gust. The Empire may have drawn a line, but the desert could erase it with one breath. The seasons added another layer of cruelty. Summers baked the land, turning scaffolding into ovens and tools into branding irons for your hands. Winters froze the earth until it was harder than stone, making digging feel like chiseling against eternity itself. Spring brought floods, washing away packed earth, undoing weeks of work. Autumn whipped winds across the ridges, stripping tents from their poles and leaving you exposed. There was no season of mercy. Each one carried its own punishment, as if the land itself conspired against you. Weather wasn't just discomfort, it was danger. A sudden storm could scatter workers, collapsing scaffolds and turning slopes into rivers of mud. Lightning forked across mountain ridges, striking closer than you'd like to remember. In winter, frostbite crept in quietly, turning toes and fingers numb until they were more wood than flesh. The Empire demanded progress regardless, but nature never signed the Emperor's decrees. It had its own laws, and you obeyed them whether you wished to or not. The soundscape of the land was just as unforgiving. Winds howled across ridges, so loud they drowned out voices. Dust storms hissed like snakes, filling your ears and mouth with grit. In desert, silence stretched so wide that even the crunch of your foot on sand felt intrusive. In mountains, echoes mocked every shout, making it unclear if the sound came from you or from something else entirely. The wall may have been the project, but the land was always the stage, and it dominated the performance. There was also the simple cruelty of distance. Supply lines stretched thin across mountains and deserts, and delays were common. Food spoiled, water ran out, tools broke with no replacements. Sometimes you worked days on half rations, hoping for the caravan to arrive, watching the horizon for dust that might mean supplies or raiders. In that sense, the wall wasn't just built against the land, it was built despite it, and often the land seemed to be winning. But perhaps the most punishing aspect of the environment was how endless it felt. When you looked around, the mountains didn't stop, the desert didn't end, the plains stretched further than your eyes could follow. Each ridge you climbed revealed another, taller one beyond it. Each valley opened into another valley, just as wide. The wall was supposed to impose order, to draw a line across chaos. But from where you stood, chaos was infinite, and you were just a speck inside it, pushing against a horizon that refused to move. Nature did not merely provide the backdrop, it pressed into every moment of your life. Take the animals, for example. The mountains and forests of northern China were home to wolves, their howls echoing at night just beyond the firelight. Hungry wolves rarely feared tired men. They lingered on the edges of camps, waiting for scraps or weakness. In the deserts, venomous snakes curled beneath rocks, invisible until your hand reached down to lift one. Scorpions hid in crevices, and their sting could cripple a man already half broken by labor. Even harmless creatures, buzzing insects, swarming flies, became torment when you were too exhausted to swat them away. Disease, too, was tied to the land. In valleys where water stagnated, fevers spread quickly. In damp mountain camps, coughs became permanent companions, rattling through the night like background music. Lice infested blankets, fleas bit into skin, and infections flourished in the smallest cut. There was no medicine beyond crude herbs and desperate prayers. You learned to live with discomfort, because to expect health was to invite disappointment. The land also dictated what you built with. In rocky ranges, stone was plentiful, so you hauled and stacked until your bones protested. In lowest plains, the fine yellow soil was tamped into rammed earth walls, layer upon layer, fragile but quick to raise. In deserts, clay and reed sometimes substituted, brittle against wind but better than nothing. The wall was not one uniform structure, it was a mirror of the land it crossed, shaped by whatever materials could be pulled from its skin. For you, that meant constant change. Each region demanded new techniques, new muscle memory, new ways to wear yourself down. And then there was the spiritual weight of geography. Chinese culture long viewed mountains as sacred, places where heaven and earth touched. Rivers carried meanings of fortune and flow. To carve a wall across such landscapes was not just physical, it was audacious, a statement that human order could tame sacred space. For workers, that left a complicated feeling. You might whisper a prayer before striking a mountain stone, or hesitate before disturbing an ancient tree. Even as you labored, some part of you wondered if the land itself resented you, and when storms tore away sections of your work, it was easy to believe the spirits had their say. Supervisors, of course, dismissed such thoughts. For them, the land was just an obstacle, and your role was to overcome it. But within the camps, whispers persisted. Men claimed to see ghosts walking the ridges, shadows of those who had collapsed before them. Others said the earth sighed at night, as if mourning the endless pounding of mallets. These stories were not told loudly. They were murmured in the dark, half believed, half feared, but always remembered when the wind howled too much like a voice. The environment even shaped your senses. Sight was narrowed by dust storms, turning the world into a blur of brown and red. Smell was dominated by sweat, smoke, and the tang of damp earth. Touch became dull, fingers numb from cold or calloused from work, until subtle textures were lost. Hearing sharpened instead, tuned to the creak of scaffolds or the distant growl of thunder, sounds that could mean danger. In this way, the land rewired you. You stopped noticing beauty and noticed only survival cues. Food, already sparse, was at the mercy of geography as well. In fertile valleys, millet and beans could sometimes be sent from nearby farms. In deserts, supplies came late, shriveled, or not at all. You learnt the taste of desperation: boiled grass, roasted roots, anything that could trick your stomach into quiet. The land fed you only reluctantly, and never enough. And still, the wall stretched onward, across the ranges of Shanxi, across the dry plateaus of Ningxie, across the edges of the Gobi itself. You never saw the end. You only saw the next slope, the next valley, the next pile of earth. Geography was the empire's greatest challenge, but it was your daily torment. The emperor drew a line across a continent. You were the one ordered to make the land obey it. In truth, the wall was less a triumph over nature than a negotiation with it. Every section bore the compromise of geography: higher in the mountains, lower in the valleys, narrower where stone was scarce, thicker where floods threatened. The land dictated terms, and the empire bent just enough to pretend it had control. For the builders, though, there was no pretending. You felt every compromise in your muscles, every adjustment in your lungs, every defeat in your bones. And perhaps that was the greatest irony. The wall was meant to be a symbol of control, of civilization imposing order on chaos. Yet to you, the chaos always felt stronger. The storms, the deserts, the mountains, they were permanent. You were not. The land endured, and you only passed across it, carrying stones that one day would crumble back into the earth. When you look back, you realize the greatest overseer was never the man with the whip. It was the land itself, the mountains that pulled you upward until your lungs begged for air, the deserts that dried your lips into cracked parchment, the winds that howled so loud they drowned out your own thoughts. Even when the overseers slept, the geography remained awake, pressing its weight against your body in silence. For the empire, the wall was a bold line of control across the horizon. For you, it was a constant reminder that the land could never truly be tamed. Every stone you lifted, every mound you tamped, every scaffold you climbed, these were not victories over nature, but small compromises bought with exhaustion. And as you lay down at night, the ground beneath you hard and unyielding, you might wonder who would last longer, the wall you had built or the mountain it clung to. Deep down, you already knew the answer. The land was eternal. You were only passing through. History remembers emperors by their titles: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor; Han Wudi, the martial emperor; Ming Hongwu, founder of a dynasty that lasted nearly 3 centuries. Each name carries weight, dignity, the aura of command, yet none of those names carried a basket of stones. None felt the ache in their shoulders or the dust in their lungs. The emperors dreamed, and you delivered. The wall was, at its heart, an imperial project. Qin Shi Huang is usually credited with the first great unification of walls. Sometime around 221 BCE, he had just conquered rival kingdoms, stitching them together into a single empire. To protect this fragile unity, he ordered that walls be connected, extended and strengthened. It was less about military practicality and more about a statement. China was no longer a collection of feuding states. It was one body, and the wall was its skin. You might imagine him as a visionary, standing on a ridge and pointing outward, declaring where the wall should run. In truth, he likely never saw most of it. His decrees travelled down the chain of officials, through generals and governors, down to overseers, and finally to you. By the time the emperor's voice reached your ears, it was no longer a command of vision. It was simply carry this rock, now. Politics drove the wall as much as threats from the north. Dynasties used it to display power, to reassure their people, to impress rivals. The Ming, centuries later, invested heavily in rebuilding and fortifying the wall, not only because of Mongol raids, but because it was a way of saying, we are strong, we are capable, we are permanent. The wall wasn't just defense, it was propaganda carved into the earth. Yet, for you, propaganda didn't fill your bowl at night. The emperor's prestige didn't ease your blistered hands. You might hear whispers of his name, perhaps even songs that praised his wisdom, but those words felt distant, floating above your world like clouds. The emperor's dream was painted in broad strokes. Your life was measured in dust. The bureaucracy that fueled the wall was as vast as the structure itself. Officials kept records of laborers, supplies, progress. Reports traveled back and forth, praising efficiency or condemning delays. But the numbers meant little. To an official in a palace, writing 10,000 workers dispatched was neat, tidy. To you, being one of those 10,000 meant losing years of your life, if not all of it. Bureaucracy turned suffering into statistics, smoothing out every jagged edge of reality until it looked respectable on paper. Sometimes the emperor himself became more legend than man. Qin Shi Huang, for example, was infamous for his obsession with immortality. He sent expeditions searching for elixirs, convinced he could cheat death. Meanwhile, countless workers died constructing his walls, his roads, his tomb. The irony was sharp. He dreamed of living forever, while his people labored themselves into early graves. If you thought about it too long, you might laugh, though not joyfully. Other rulers followed similar patterns. Han emperors extended the wall to secure Silk Road trade routes, ensuring wealth flowed into the empire. The Ming rebuilt it to withstand cavalry raids, making it taller, stronger, more permanent. Each dynasty framed the wall as necessary, even sacred, but each time the burden fell on the same shoulders. Peasants, prisoners, exiles, different emperors, same command. Even the language used to describe your labor was political. Officials wrote about mobilizing the people, as if you were a resource like timber or stone. They spoke of strengthening the frontier, not of breaking bodies. In documents, suffering disappeared. What remained was the illusion of order, of unity, of collective purpose. You were not seen as a person, you were seen as an extension of imperial will. And yet, paradoxically, emperors also feared the wall. They feared what it revealed about their rule. If the empire were truly strong, truly stable, why would such a barrier be needed? In some ways, the wall was less a sign of strength than of anxiety. It confessed in stone and earth that even the mightiest dynasty was vulnerable. For you, however, this fear translated into endless labor. The emperor's insecurity became your daily exhaustion. It's worth pausing on how different the emperor's world was from yours. He dined on delicacies, surrounded by silk curtains and jade cups. You ate millet from a cracked bowl. He was entertained by music, dancers, and scholars. You heard only the grunt of labor and the bark of orders. He dreamed of eternity. You struggled for tomorrow, and yet somehow your lives were bound together. His vision, your burden. From time to time, rumors spread through the camps about the emperor's deeds. Perhaps he had built a new palace. Perhaps he had ordered a grand festival. These stories didn't inspire pride. They inspired bitterness. You couldn't help but notice the contrast. While you carried stones up mountains, he carried nothing heavier than a cup of wine. But politics rarely listens to bitterness. The wall went on, century after century, because emperors needed it to symbolize their reigns. It was a monument to their ambition, carved by hands that history never named. You were part of a system where the powerful imagined greatness, and the powerless gave it shape. And so the wall became less about defense and more about memory. Each emperor added his section, each dynasty stamped its identity upon it. To them, it was history in the making. To you, it was just another rock. The Han dynasty, which ruled from roughly 2006 BCE to 2020 CE, gave the wall its first truly imperial scale. While Qin Shi Huang had set the precedent, it was the Han who saw the wall not just as a shield, but as an artery for empire. They expanded it westward to guard the Silk Road, that fragile line of trade that carried silk, jade, and spices outward, while bringing horses, glass, and ideas inward. Protecting those routes wasn't only about defense, it was about wealth. Every caravan that passed through meant taxes, tribute, and prestige for the court, so the wall became a guardian of commerce. For you, though, it meant building watchtowers and fortifications not for your own safety, but for goods you would never see, and luxuries you would never touch. The Han also professionalized the wall's maintenance, stationing soldiers along it permanently. This added a new layer to the politics. The wall wasn't just about keeping enemies out, but about keeping soldiers in place, ensuring Imperial presence stretched into the frontier. To you as a builder, this meant more infrastructure, barracks, roads, wells. Every soldier housed meant another task for your hands, another stone to lift. Centuries later, the Tang dynasty largely ignored the wall, focusing instead on diplomacy and trade. Their strategy leaned more on alliances than fortifications. For a while, the wall fell quiet. You might think this would be a reprieve for builders, and it was for a time. But dynasties are like seasons, each bringing their own storms. The Tang faded, and chaos returned. New rulers rose, old threats revived, and once again the wall's stones were called to order. Then came the Ming dynasty in the 14th century. If Qin Shi Huang gave the wall its birth, the Ming gave it the face you would recognize today. Brick, stone, towers rising from ridges like teeth. The Mongols had been a constant shadow, and the Ming emperors poured staggering resources into fortification. Unlike earlier dynasties that relied heavily on rammed earth, the Ming invested in masonry. Their wall wasn't just defense, it was a statement of permanence, and permanence required endless labor. For you, this was both a curse and a shift in rhythm. Masonry was sturdier, yes, but it demanded more skill, more hauling, more precision. A block of brick had to be fired, transported, stacked. It wasn't just pounding soil into frames, it was construction in its heaviest sense. And unlike rammed earth, which could be shaped quickly, stone lingered. Once laid, it demanded you keep going, because its unfinished edges mocked you until they were complete. The Ming also tied the wall tightly into their politics of legitimacy. They had overthrown the Yuan, the dynasty founded by Mongol conquerors. For them, building the wall was not just about keeping nomads out, it was about proving they were no longer vulnerable to them. The wall became a psychological fortress as much as a physical one. In Imperial records, it was described as a shield of heaven, a boundary that divided order from chaos. For you, of course, it was still a pile of rocks. But in the Emperor's mind, those rocks carried divine meaning. Economic motives threaded through every dynasty's wall building. Walls weren't just barriers, they were also tax lines. To cross them meant tribute. To live near them meant surveillance. As a builder, you didn't think in those terms, but you were constructing more than defense. You were building the empire's grip on its people. In many ways, the wall was less about keeping outsiders away than about keeping insiders under control. The political theatre of the wall was perhaps its most striking irony. Foreign envoys, when visiting the court, were told of its greatness, its immensity, its invincibility. They rarely saw its weakest, crumbling sections. They saw the proud towers near Beijing, the polished stretches intended to impress. The wall was a performance curated for diplomacy, but you knew the truth, that hundreds of miles away, sections sagged into mud, neglected, half-eaten by storms. The empire showed one face to the world and another to its laborers. Dynasties also used the wall to channel discontent. Building projects soaked up the labor of restless peasants and prisoners. Instead of plotting rebellion, men were too exhausted to think. You might not have realized it, but your suffering was a strategy. By scattering thousands of men across distant frontiers, the empire drained energy that might otherwise have gathered into resistance. In this sense, the wall was as much about ruling its own people as it was about guarding against outsiders. It's worth pausing on the sheer continuity. Dynasties rose, fell, collapsed in fire and intrigue, but the wall went on. Each new ruler claimed to renew it, expand it, reimagine it. Each one acted as if they were the first to conceive of it. But in reality, you were always working on someone else's project, inheriting the burden of generations past. The wall was never finished because politics never rested. And still, the emperors dreamed. They imagined the wall as eternal, as a monument to their greatness. Yet they never asked what eternity cost. For you, eternity meant one more sunrise, one more stone, one more season of labor that blurred into another. Their dreams stretched across centuries, but your life ended far shorter. Politics demanded eternity. The human body could only give years. The wall, in the end, was never just a line of defense. It was a mirror of politics. Each emperor looked into that mirror and saw what he wanted. Strength, legitimacy, permanence. For Qin Shi Huang, it was the skin of a new empire. For the Han, it was the guardian of trade. For the Ming, it was proof that China would never again bow to stepriders. But for you, the mirror showed only dust, stone, and the face of exhaustion. The emperors dreamed of eternity, yet eternity was carried one stone at a time by men who would never be remembered. The wall was their legacy, but it was your burden. Their ambitions stretched across centuries, but your life was measured in seasons of labor. And when dynasties crumbled, when palaces burned, when emperors vanished into history, the wall remained silent, indifferent, and still built on the backs of those who never had a choice. You were not a statesman, nor a soldier, nor a name in the records. You were simply one of the countless hands that turned the emperor's vision into reality. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of the wall. It was not built by greatness, but by endurance. The emperors claimed the glory. The workers carried the weight. Imagine this. After years of toil, the wall finally rises behind you. Not complete, not polished, but high enough, wide enough to stand as a frontier. You've hauled stones, tamped earth, dragged timber, and then you're told you won't be going home. Instead, you're staying. You're no longer just a builder. You're a guard, a living extension of the wall itself. At first glance, this might sound like an improvement. After all, carrying a spear and standing watch must be easier than carrying stones up a mountain. But the reality is far less forgiving. Being stationed on the wall was not glory. It was monotony, cold and hunger drawn out across seasons. You traded the crushing weight of labor for the crushing weight of boredom and isolation. Your post was a watchtower, stone or brick if you were lucky, rammed earth if you weren't. Inside, the space was cramped, dark, filled with the smell of smoke from a small fire and the must of damp straw mats. You slept alongside a handful of other soldiers, your armor stacked neatly beside you, your spear within arm's reach. Privacy didn't exist. You ate together, slept together, worked together, and grew sick of one another's breathing. Duties were simple but endless. Patrol the wall, watch the horizon, light beacon fires if raiders approached, maintain weapons, drill when commanded. The problem was not complexity but repetition. Days passed with nothing to report, nothing to see but empty plains and rolling hills. Your eyes scanned the distance so often that the landscape burned into them, a permanent image of emptiness. Food was little better than what you had as a laborer. Millet porridge, dried vegetables, beans when available. Meat was rare, usually only when animals were hunted, or when the supply line happened to be generous. Salt fish might arrive, but by the time it reached your tower, it was half rotten. Meals were functional, never satisfying. You ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. The climate punished soldiers as much as builders. In winter, the wind pierced through armor and cloth alike, leaving your fingers stiff and your face raw. Fires gave little warmth, and the smoke often made your eyes water. In summer, the sun hammered down, turning watchtowers into ovens. Armor grew heavy with sweat. Straps chafed and helmets burned against your scalp. The wall was not built in a place where anyone was meant to live. It was a line drawn across extremes, and you were expected to endure them without complaint. Yet the greatest enemy was not the nomads across the frontier. It was time that crawled so slowly you could measure it in the crackling of a fire, in the drip of melting snow, in the call of a distant bird. Boredom gnawed at you. You polished your spear not because it needed it, but because you needed something to do. You checked the horizon even when you knew no one was coming. You invented small rituals, counting stones in the wall, scratching marks into wood, reciting poems from memory, if you happened to know any, anything to make the days less empty. Still, danger was always possible, and that possibility shaped every moment. A rider on the horizon might be a trader, or it might be a raider. A sudden cloud of dust could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. You lived in a state of vigilance, half asleep yet always tense. If the beacon fire had to be lit, if horns had to sound, you knew the wall's promise of safety was only half true. Raiders could break through, attacks could overwhelm, and then you would discover that standing guard was not easier than carrying stones. It was merely another form of risk. Relationships among soldiers were as strained as they were necessary. You relied on each other, because loneliness on the wall could eat you alive. And yet the closeness bred irritation. The same face at breakfast, the same voice at night, the same complaints repeated until they echoed in your skull. Fights broke out, often over trivial things: food, shifts, words spoken too harshly. Discipline kept them from going too far, but resentment lingered like smoke. Letters from home, when they arrived, were treasures. A scrap of paper, a few words from a wife, a brother, a parent. It reminded you that life still existed beyond the wall. But letters often didn't come. The distance was too great, the roads too dangerous. Weeks, months, even years could pass with nothing but silence. Eventually you wondered if home remembered you at all. Pay was promised, of course. Soldiers were supposed to receive stipends, grain, sometimes cloth. But corruption ate at the system. Officials skimmed off the top, supplies disappeared, wages arrived late or not at all. You were left with empty promises, standing on stones you had helped build, wondering if your loyalty meant anything to those in the capital. And yet, despite all this, there was a strange pride. Standing on the wall at dawn, watching mist curl through valleys, you felt the immensity of what had been built. You knew you were a speck, but a speck on something vast, something that stretched further than sight. The wall was cruel, but it was also awe-inspiring. And though you might curse the emperor, the overseers, the officials, you could not deny that you were part of something larger than yourself. Guarding the wall was not glory, it was not romance, it was survival, stretched out like the horizon itself. And in the silence of those watchtowers, you realized that the wall's true strength was not in stone or earth. It was in the endurance of those who lived upon it, season after season, waiting for enemies who might never come. Soldiering on the wall was not a matter of standing tall in gleaming armor, as paintings and dramas later suggested. It was a matter of hierarchy, of being slotted into a system that valued order more than comfort. At the top stood commanders, often appointed by the court in faraway capitals. Beneath them captains and sergeants, who managed the garrisons and ensured discipline. And then at the base, you, the foot soldier, one of thousands, interchangeable, easily replaced. Orders flowed downward like water, from emperor to general, general to captain, captain to sergeant, sergeant to you. By the time commands reached your ears, they were stripped of grandeur, reduced to blunt instructions: patrol, watch, drill. The emperor's strategy might speak of destiny. For you it translated to another sleepless night on the ramparts. Discipline was constant. Miss a shift and you might lose a week's rations. Fall asleep on watch and punishment was swift: beating, confinement, sometimes worse. The wall was not forgiving. An inattentive guard could put an entire garrison at risk, and so fear was built into the system. You learned to keep your eyes open, even when exhaustion blurred your vision, even when the horizon was as still as a painting. Desertion was a constant temptation. Many soldiers thought of slipping away, back to villages where life, however poor, at least held family and freedom. But desertion was dangerous. Patrols scoured the land, punishments were severe, and deserters often faced death if caught. Worse still, even if you escaped, where would you go? You were stationed on the edge of empire, surrounded by wilderness, mountains, deserts. The wall was designed to keep enemies out, but it also kept you in. Life in garrisons extended beyond the wall itself. Small settlements sprouted nearby, clusters of huts and stalls where soldiers' families sometimes lived. Traders brought goods, cloth, salt, wine, even the occasional luxury from caravans passing the Silk Road. These frontier outposts became their own ecosystems, half military, half civilian, sustained by the endless presence of the wall. For a soldier, this meant rare opportunities, to barter, to taste something different, to remember that life was not only spears and watchtowers. But garrisons were fragile. Supplies faltered. Merchants avoided dangerous routes. Bandits struck. In lean years, soldiers turned to the land itself, hunting rabbits in hills, fishing rivers if they existed, gathering herbs and roots. Your spear meant for raiders was just as often pointed at game. Duty blurred into survival, because the wall was never as self-sufficient as the court imagined. Punishments extended beyond the individual. If a section of the wall failed, if a raid succeeded, if a tower collapsed, entire units could be held responsible. Commanders were demoted, soldiers beaten, supplies withheld. The system valued order above fairness. It mattered little whether you had done your duty well. What mattered was that the empire's line had held. If it cracked, you cracked with it. Yet, despite the strictness, There was camaraderie. Soldiers learned to rely on one another. Shared watch shifts, whispered jokes in the dark, the passing of a flask of cheap wine, all were ways of enduring together. You might not trust your commander, but you trusted the man beside you on the rampart. Bonds were forged not in glory, but in monotony, in the endless act of waiting together. Cultural life seeped in as well. Soldiers carved graffiti into stones, names, crude drawings, snatches of poetry. Archaeologists today still find them. Little voices scratching at silence. Some inscriptions prayed for safety. Others cursed superiors. Others simply marked presence. I was here. These etchings were not for emperors nor for history. They were for the soldier himself. A quiet rebellion against anonymity. Over time, garrisons developed their own rhythms. Festivals were celebrated, often in modest ways. Lanterns lit, simple songs sung, rituals performed with whatever offerings could be gathered. For a night, the wall softened and laughter replaced vigilance. But even then, the horizon loomed. You never forgot that you were stationed at the Empire's edge, where danger could ride in at any moment. And danger did come. Raiders struck swiftly, using speed against your immovable stones. A cloud of dust might appear, and suddenly the horizon burned with horsemen. In those moments, boredom vanished, replaced by terror. Horns sounded, beacon fires lit, arrows loosed. You realized that all those months of dull patrol had been a prelude to this, the true test of the wall. But the test was not fair. You were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, dependent on whether reinforcements came. Sometimes the wall held, sometimes it broke. When peace returned, you returned to waiting, to scanning the horizon, to polishing weapons, to marking days with scratches in wood. Guarding the wall was a cycle of extremes, endless monotony, pierced by sudden chaos. You never knew when the stillness would shatter, only that it eventually would. And so the soldier's life became a paradox. You were stationed on one of the greatest structures in human history, yet you felt small, replaceable, unseen. You were supposed to represent the Empire's strength, yet you often felt its neglect. You were a guardian of civilization, and yet, most of the time, you were simply a man staring into empty distance, waiting for something to happen. In the stillness of the watchtower, you learned that guarding the wall was not about constant action. It was about endurance, about living in the long spaces between events. The Empire called you a soldier, a defender, a guardian of civilization, but most of the time you were simply a pair of eyes staring at the horizon, a body enduring wind, cold and time. The wall looked strong beneath your feet, yet you knew its strength was fragile. It depended not only on stones and towers, but on weary men who stayed awake when they wanted to sleep, who fought when they wanted to run, who waited when nothing seemed to happen at all. The Empire remembered emperors and generals, but the wall was kept alive by soldiers whose names never reached a scroll. And so you stood, season after season, on that endless line, not with glory, not with grandeur, but with patience. The wall was stone, you were flesh, and yet, for as long as you endured, the two became one. The Great Wall may have been built of stone, earth, and sweat, but it was remembered in stories. When you live beside something so vast, so consuming, you cannot help but tell tales about it. And for those who labored on it, or who watched fathers and brothers vanish into its construction, myth became a way of softening reality, of explaining what could not otherwise be endured. One of the most famous legends is that of Meng Jiangnü. Her husband was conscripted to work on the wall, and when he failed to return, she journeyed to find him. Upon learning that he had died and been buried within its stones, she wept so bitterly that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing his bones. In official histories, workers were anonymous, faceless, but in legend they were given names, wives, grief. Meng Jiangnü's story became a quiet rebellion against the erasure of human suffering. It told people what they already felt. The wall was built not only of stone, but of lives. You can imagine how such a story spread. Around campfires, in villages, in whispers passed between mothers and daughters. It was not just a tale, it was a release, a way of grieving without openly defying the Empire. To weep for Meng Jiangnü was to weep for everyone lost to the wall, without needing to say their names. Other myths painted the wall as haunted. Workers who vanished, men who collapsed in silence were said to linger in its stones. Watchmen claimed to hear voices in the wind, groans in the night, footsteps on empty ramparts. Whether you believed them or not, such stories carried truth in metaphor. The wall was haunted, if not by spirits, then by memory. Every stone carried a trace of the hands that had lifted it, the breaths that had ended before their time. Folk songs added another layer. Some were laments, slow and mournful, sung by wives left behind, or by men who returned broken. Others were work songs, rhythmic chants to keep time while ramming earth or hauling stone. These songs rarely survived in written form, but echoes of them linger in later collections of folk poetry. They remind us that even amid silence and exhaustion, people found a way to voice what they could not speak plainly: sorrow, anger, endurance. Legends also sought to explain the wall's sheer scale. How could something so vast be built by human hands alone? Some tales claimed that dragons guided its path, carving ridges through mountains so men could follow. Others said that spirits lent strength, holding stones in place when human arms grew weak. These stories did not erase the suffering. They disguised it with wonder, turning impossible labor into something touched by the divine. For those who lived near the wall, myths gave it personality. It was not just stone, it was a being, a presence, a force. Some villages treated it almost like a mountain spirit, offering sacrifices at its base. Others feared it, warning children not to wander too close at night, lest the wall swallow them as it had swallowed so many workers. In these beliefs, the wall was alive, hungry, watchful, demanding. There is a certain irony here. The emperors built the wall to project strength and permanence, but in the minds of common people, it became a symbol of fragility, of loss, of longing. Its stones were remembered not only as barriers against invaders, but as tombs of the nameless. Myth kept alive what history tried to forget. And myth was not only sadness. Some stories, surprisingly, turned the wall into a backdrop for humour. Peasants joked that the wall must be long enough to keep even the gods out, or that it was merely an expensive excuse to keep men too busy to cause trouble. These jests were small rebellions, ways of laughing at something that otherwise crushed the spirit. The wall was too vast to resist, but it could be mocked in whispers. If you stood on the wall at dusk, you might feel the pull of these stories, the wind brushing against the stones, the silence settling as fires burned below. It was easy to imagine the presence of something more than human. The myths were not illusions, they were reflections of the truth, that the wall was not just a structure but a vessel for every fear, hope and grief of the people who lived in its shadow. Across China's vast regions, stories about the wall shifted like the landscapes it crossed. In the northwest, where deserts stretched dry and endless, villagers spoke of spirits in sandstorms, restless souls of conscripts whose bones had been buried under dunes. They said if you listened closely to the whistling wind, you could hear not just the voice of the storm, but the cries of men who had once lifted stones there. In mountain regions, where clouds wrapped around towers, the wall was imagined as a dragon's spine curling across ridges, alive and eternal. These myths gave geography meaning. Where official decrees saw only terrain to be conquered, folk belief saw living landscapes infused with memory. The crumbling tower was not just erosion, it was the sorrow of workers whose lives had been consumed there. A section swallowed by sand was not negligence, it was the desert reclaiming what humans had tried to impose. For villagers, the wall was never just engineering, it was story carved into earth. Poets of later dynasties turned these stories into verses. Tang and Song poets wrote of the wall as a place of absence. Absent fathers, absent sons, absent husbands. The frontier became a metaphor for distance, separation, longing. A woman waiting at home might compose a poem imagining her husband standing watch on the wall, staring into emptiness as she stared into silence. Through poetry, the wall became less a structure of defense and more a structure of grief, bridging the personal and the political. Even officials, who were supposed to celebrate the wall, sometimes questioned it through literature. Confucian scholars occasionally wrote lines lamenting the waste of human life, wondering aloud whether all this stone and earth truly protected the empire or merely consumed its people. They could not say this too directly, but metaphors allowed them to criticize without rebellion. In their verses, the wall stood as both monument and accusation. Theatrical retellings further shaped the wall's mythology. In operas, the story of Meng Jiangnü became a staple, the faithful wife whose tears tore down stone, whose grief spoke louder than imperial decrees. Audiences wept, not just for her but for all the invisible figures lost in construction. To watch such a play was to admit what official histories denied, that the wall was a graveyard as much as a barrier. Regional festivals sometimes incorporated the wall into ritual life. Offerings were left at certain towers, wine poured, incense burned, not as acts of loyalty to the state, but as quiet gestures to ancestors. Families who suspected their relatives had been swallowed by the wall treated it as a tomb, praying for peace, asking for blessings. These rituals were unofficial, unsanctioned, but they persisted because grief cannot be erased by decree. Legends also transformed the wall into a stage for moral lessons. In some tales, tyrannical overseers were punished by spirits for their cruelty, their arrogance humbled by storms or sudden collapses. In others, diligent workers were said to find hidden treasures in the soil, gifts from the earth for their endurance. These stories did not change the reality of suffering, but they offered a sense of balance that somewhere justice existed, even if only in imagination. As centuries passed, the wall's image shifted again. By the late Imperial period, when foreign travelers began writing about it, Chinese scholars sometimes reframed it as a symbol of civilization's resilience. Myths of ghosts and grieving widows softened into symbols of strength, dignity, continuity. The wall became less haunted in the telling and more heroic. Yet beneath that polished surface, folk memory lingered. The quieter stories, the whispers about bones in the stones, the echoes in the wind. In this way, the wall became two things at once: the official monument of emperors, praised in records and speeches, and the unofficial monument of the people, mourned in legends and songs. One version celebrated power, the other remembered pain. Both survived, woven together, inseparable. And if you stood at its edge, listening to the wind, you might hear both voices at once. The emperor's boast echoing across centuries, and beneath it, softer but more enduring, the murmur of those who had no names but left their presence in stories. The Great Wall was never just stone, it was story, carried in whispers, in songs, in legends that softened the sharpness of reality. For emperors, it was a symbol of order. For poets, it was a symbol of longing. For villagers, it was a symbol of loss. And in every version it became larger than its physical form, an idea stretched across the landscape as surely as the stones themselves. You might never see your own name carved into a scroll, but stories like those of Meng Jiangnu, of dragons carving ridges, of spirits walking the ramparts, those were the ways ordinary people kept memory alive. They gave voice to what history erased. They reminded each generation that behind the wall's grandeur lay countless unseen lives. And so, when you walk along its stones, you are not just treading on a fortification, you are walking on a library of memory, on myths that still breathe between the cracks. The wall is stone, yes, but it is also sorrow, imagination, defiance, and love. It is both monument and story, equally. History tends to measure the Great Wall in miles, in dynasties, in towers and stones, but the true measure lies in what was taken away, quietly, piece by piece, from the people who lived in its shadow. The wall was not only built on the frontier, it reached deep into the heart of the empire, into villages, kitchens, and families, pulling them apart as surely as it rose across mountains. When you were conscripted, you didn't leave alone. You left a family that suddenly faced absence as its new companion. A wife left without a husband, children left without a father, parents left without the son who might have cared for them in their old age. Fields went untended, tools rusted in corners, harvests shrank. The empire demanded your body for the wall, but it demanded your family's endurance for survival. Imagine the silence in a small home after conscription, the place at the table left empty, the tools leaning against the wall untouched, a wife rising before dawn to tend fields alone, her hands blistered by work that once had been shared, children helping as best they could, their games cut short by necessity. Every absence in labour rippled outward, making survival at home as exhausting as the work on the wall itself. Letters, when they came, were rare. Often they didn't come at all. Distance and danger swallowed them. Families might wait months, years, never knowing if their husband, father, or son still lived. Rumours filled the silence. Stories of men collapsing in the dust, of workers vanishing into storms, of soldiers who never returned. The wall was not only a line across the land, it was a wall between families, separating them with uncertainty. Villages, too, felt the toll. When large numbers of men were conscripted, the balance of life shifted. Fields overgrew, irrigation channels crumbled, harvests dwindled. Communities that had once thrived on cooperation grew brittle under strain. Women, children, and the elderly bore the weight of survival. The Empire's great project drained not just the bodies of its workers, but the vitality of the villages they left behind. And then there was grief. Silent, unrecorded, but omnipresent. Families often never received word of death. A man simply did not return. Was he buried in the stones? Was he lost in the desert? Was he alive somewhere serving as a guard in a distant tower? Families were left with questions instead of closure. That uncertainty was its own kind of wound, one that never healed because it was never allowed to end. For some, grief transformed into ritual. Families offered incense at local shrines, whispered prayers for absent loved ones, folded paper offerings to send across the unseen divide. They treated the wall itself as a tomb, even if they had no grave to visit. To mourn in this way was an act of resilience, of refusing to let the Empire's silence erase personal loss. The toll was not only emotional, it was generational. Children grew up without fathers, learning labor too early, losing childhood to survival. Women aged quickly under the burden of work and worry. Entire family lines sometimes withered, unable to sustain themselves without the men who had been taken. The wall stretched across landscapes, but its shadow fell across generations. The irony, of course, is that the Empire rarely noticed. Records mentioned numbers, not names. Reports counted conscripts, supplies, progress, but not the empty places at family tables. To the court, the toll was invisible. To the villagers, it was everything. The wall consumed lives quietly, not with spectacle but with erosion, wearing down families the way wind wears down stone. And yet, memory endured. Folk tales like Mengjang Niu's weeping were not only about one woman, they were about all families who had wept. Songs sung in villages were not only laments for lost husbands, they were laments for the quiet suffering that bound communities together. The hidden toll became visible only in these small acts of remembrance, carried not by officials but by ordinary people. So, when you think of the Great Wall, you must imagine more than towers and ridges. You must imagine the silences in kitchens, the empty fields, the unanswered prayers. You must see not only the stones that remain, but the lives that vanished so they could be laid. The wall was never just a monument of defence. It was a monument of absence. Its stones balanced not only on the backs of workers, but on the hollow spaces they left behind. By now you understand. The wall is majestic in photographs, powerful in imagination, but to live it, to build it, to guard it, to lose family to it, was to endure a reality of hunger, cold, monotony, and loss. You would not survive, not because you are weak, but because no one truly did. They endured for a while, but the wall always took more than it gave. And yet the wall remains, a line across mountains and deserts, across history itself. It remembers no names, but every stone is a quiet witness. And as you drift to sleep, you might hear what the emperors never did, the whispers of those forgotten lives still lingering in the wind.